Good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Ann Thompson, the Assistant Director for Public Services at the Essex Library, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event, Putin's War on Ukraine, presented by Professor Peter Rutland. Just a few house rules. Looks like you're all following all the way every rule we have. Please keep your microphones muted and your cameras off. As questions occur to you, if it's something that you think would be relevant in the moment, please go ahead and raise your hand. And we'll call on you to shout out your question. Otherwise, go ahead and feel free to put it in the chat and we'll get to those questions after the presentation. It is my great honor this evening to welcome Professor Peter Rutland to our community. He is Professor of Government and the Colin and Nancy Campbell Chair for Global Issues and Democratic Thought at Wesleyan University. An expert in contemporary Russian nationalism, politics, and economy, he has studied Russia and the former Soviet Union for over 3 decades. He has also taught at universities in England, Russia, Japan, Israel, and the Czech Republic. He is currently Vice President of the Association for Study of Nationalities, an Associate Editor of Russian Review, and former Editor-in-Chief of Nationalities Papers. Professor Rutland, the microphone is yours.
Great, thank you, Anne, for having me, and to everybody for turning up for this discussion of this grim topic. So I have a slide presentation, so I will go into share screen mode, and I'm happy to take questions along the way, or we can wait until the end. So. So I'll start off with these two quotations from Vladimir Putin's Deputy Chief of Staff, saying there is no Russia today if there is no Putin. And then Putin himself saying, do we need a world without Russia in it? So this is a very striking compression of Russia and the world, and Putin and Russia. And that gets to my core argument tonight, that the war in Ukraine is a war about identity, about Russia's identity as a nation. And Putin sees it as his historic mission to defend Russia by occupying Ukraine and by destroying Ukraine to solidify Russia's security and Russia's identity. So why did Putin start this war now? My basic argument is the following, that at the macro level, at the global level, Putin thought that Russia was getting stronger, that the US was weaker, as shown by the retreat from Afghanistan, and other economic and political failures, such as the January 6th uprising in the US. So we saw the US as retreating internationally, and Russia was getting stronger. However, at the same time as Russia was projecting its power in Syria, in the war in Syria, in Georgia, in 2008 war in Georgia, it was losing its grip over Ukraine. That specifically within Ukraine, Russian influence was decreasing, especially during and after the 2014 Maidan revolution. So Putin has been planning this war for years, and he sees this war as a way to clean up the problem of Ukraine, and he was confident that he was going to be victorious and have an easy victory. And we'll see why he thought that and why he was wrong. One point to bear in mind is that this war began in February 2014, not in February 22. And the Ukrainians knew this, of course, but the Russians also saw themselves as at war since 2014. And somehow in the West, we kind of didn't notice this. But the 2014 crisis began with the Maidan revolution in Kiev, which toppled the government of President Yanukovych. And in retaliation, Russia seized the province of Crimea and also instigated rebellions in the provinces of Donetsk and Luhansk. And in this map, the dark brown areas are the areas with a majority Russian language speaking population. And what's also striking about this war that began in 2014 was many of the themes and memes of the war today were already rolled out in 2014. So this is a billboard from the referendum that took place in Crimea in March 2014, where they could vote to join Russia. And the poster says, you choose on the 16th of March, do you want a Nazi Crimea or a Russian Crimea? So this branding of the Ukrainian government as Nazi already began in 2014. And one of the more absurd claims of the Russian invasion of Ukraine was the desire to denazify Ukraine. Another thing that appeared early on is the threat of use of nuclear weapons. So this is a notorious screenshot from a television broadcast in March 2014, where Dmitry Kiselyov, the host on this major state TV channel, warns the Americans, says, the Americans should remember that we are the only country on earth that can reduce you to radioactive dust within minutes. And that's what the word says there, into radioactive dust. So this nuclear saber rattling, reminding the West that Russia has nuclear weapons and is willing to use them first, that's been a common theme. Now, much of the discussion about the causes of the war focuses on NATO expansion and the fact that in 2008, the US said it was in principle open to Ukraine and Georgia joining NATO. And this is Russia's main argument about why they went to war, because NATO posed a threat. And this cartoon is from a Chinese government-sponsored newspaper, which captures that idea. China is kind of blaming the United States for this war by saying if the United States hadn't kept expanding NATO eastwards, Russia wouldn't have felt the need to defend itself. And so sticking with that argument for a while, this is the map showing the retreat of the boundary of the Russian state. That when it was the Soviet Union, it reached all the way to Poland and Romania. And then when the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia retreated 600 or 700 miles east, and all those dark green countries became independent states. And as Russia retreated east, NATO followed it. So NATO expanded, incorporating Poland and Czech Republic and the Baltic states and Romania and Bulgaria. So that's the argument about NATO expansion as a threat. However, I don't buy the argument at all. For one thing, NATO is a defensive alliance. It's not about attacking other countries. And anyway, Russia is a nuclear power, so nobody's going to attack Russia directly, militarily. So there is no military threat to Russia from NATO. Moreover, Ukraine was not yet a member of NATO, and there was no clear plan for it to join NATO, so it's really a bit of a red herring. That said, if NATO had stuck with neutrality and had pledged never to join NATO with guarantees to that effect from the United States and others, maybe the war might have been avoided, but we'll never know the answer to that. If it's not about NATO, what is it then? It's about two things. It's about the United States and it's about Europe. So I think the main factor driving Putin is resentment at the United States, the dominant global power, the power that Russians think brought about the economic collapse of the Soviet Union and the chaos of the 1990s. That's all blamed on the West, although the reality was it was just a homegrown collapse of a dysfunctional system. More broadly, the Russians resent US displays of military power around the world, the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, the bombing of Serbia in 1999 and Libya in 2011. All those factors made the Russians resentful and looking for a chance to kind of pay back the United States. And unfortunately, they've chosen Ukraine as the field on which they can inflict a strategic defeat on the US. The second thing it's about is Europe, that it's important to remember that in 2014, NATO was not an issue. It wasn't on the table. What was on the table in 2014 was Ukraine's signing an associate status agreement with the European Union. It wanted a free trade agreement with the EU. And at the last minute in November 2013, President Yanukovych pulled out of the deal because Russia offered him a better deal. They offered him a $15 billion loan and a free trade deal with Russia, but Ukraine couldn't sign both. So the issue that caused the revolution in 2014 was closer ties to the European Union, not NATO. Why would Ukraine want to join the EU? It's clear from this chart, which shows real GDP compared to the European average from 1990 to 2020. And you can see the countries on the left are all the countries that joined the EU, and they've experienced like a doubling in living standards since 1990. The countries on the right are those that did not join the EU, and they have a much poorer economic record. And Ukraine in particular on the right there has seen a halving of living standards since 1990. So Ukraine has just overtaken Moldova as the poorest country in Europe. This is before the invasion, with $3,000 per head per year income. So Ukraine's position as a halfway house between Russia and Europe simply wasn't working for it economically. So the Ukrainians thought, let's try getting closer to Europe. Why can't we be like Lithuania or Poland? That was that was and is their goal. More than geopolitics is at stake, it's also about identity, that Putin sees himself as the ruler of Russia, and it's his kind of sacred mission to protect and preserve Russia. And the geography is that Russia is now back in the boundaries that it occupied in about 1700. So they've gone 300 years back. And Putin doesn't like that, and he wants to reincorporate Belarus and Ukraine into the Russian state. Not sure about whether he wants Kazakhstan and Central Asia, probably not, but the Kazakhs are certainly very worried by the invasion of Ukraine, because they have about 25% of the Kazakhstan's population is ethnic Russian. So Putin, as you may have recall, back in July last year, wrote a very strange history article where he argued that Ukraine shouldn't exist as a state, and that Ukrainians don't exist as a people distinct from the Russians. And he had this argument that Ukraine was created by Lenin and Stalin. Very strange argument. And he completely denies Ukraine agency. So he sees the Ukrainian government as just tools of the West, puppets of the West. This is a map of Russia as it was in, the green is Russia as it was in 1700, and you can see that the Kingdom of Poland occupied much of the territory of what is now Belarus and Ukraine, and Russia had still not yet got access to the Black Sea. Those territories were controlled by the Crimean Tatars. So why did Putin oppose Ukraine joining the West? It was partly economic interests, that Russia had a lot of business interests in Ukraine, especially in the industrial zone of the Donbass. But mainly it was a fear of democracy, that if Ukraine became more democratic, a democratic Ukraine could be a platform to spread democratic ideas into Belarus, Kazakhstan, and even Russia itself. And that was the first color revolution of 2004 in Ukraine, saw the toppling of a pro-Russian president and the election of a pro-Western president. And then the 2014 was a kind of replay of that. And so Russia looks at Ukraine as a source of instability because of its openness to popular protests and democratization. Now, in the past 10 years or so, if not 20 years, Ukrainian society was split between people who wanted to have good relations with Russia and people who wanted to draw closer to the West. And Russia thought it could manipulate Ukrainian politics to preserve this polarization by funding and promoting pro-Russian politicians and oligarchs within Ukraine. But the confrontation of 2014 changed that strategy. And since 2014, the pro-Russian politicians within Ukraine have been increasingly marginalized. So Russia felt it was losing control of Ukraine. Now, what gave Putin confidence to launch this war? We now know that the war wasn't over in 48 hours, that his idea that he could just send some paratroopers in to the airport near Kiev and then they would drive into Kiev and capture the president and change the government, that didn't happen. So Putin miscalculated badly about his military capacity and the resistance of the Ukrainians. But more broadly, he was confident because of Russia's dominant position on European energy markets. So he thought Europe, and especially Germany, is totally dependent on Russia for its energy, gets 40% of its natural gas, 25% of its oil from Russia. So Germany or the other Europeans won't be able to stand up and tell me to stop because they would fear having the energy cut off. And during 2021, Putin was very clever in cutting back on the gas deliveries to Europe, natural gas, such that the storage capacity in Europe was only 25% full. Normally they would fill up the gas storage during the summer when there's not such a big demand. But last summer, Russia wasn't selling any extra gas at all. And so the storage was very low. And this caused a panic at the end of 2021 when Europeans realized they wouldn't, if it was a cold winter, they wouldn't have enough gas to last through the winter. And the price went through the roof. The natural gas price wholesale in Europe increased 500%. And that is now feeding through into fuel bills in Britain and France and Germany, and they're looking at 100% increase in the fuel bills already. More broadly, on the geopolitics front, Biden was seen as a weak president and not interested in a military confrontation in Europe. He was going to focus on American domestic politics. So Putin thought he would be pushing at an open door. Thirdly, on the military front, Russia had enjoyed what it saw as convincing military success in Georgia 2008, Crimea 2014, and Syria 2015. They came out on the winning side in each three of those conflicts. And so Putin was extrapolating from that experience, but invading Ukraine with 40 million people in a country bigger than France is a very different story than those earlier, very targeted interventions. Putin's main mistake was in underestimating the cohesion and national pride of the Ukrainian people. He saw Ukraine as a failed state with an unpopular leader, and the Ukraine would simply fold in the face of Russian invasion. And that did not happen. And President Zelensky, he had become increasingly unpopular. The ratings and opinion polls had Zelensky down to 25% at the end of 2021. But he rallied in the face of Russia's invasion and has become a remarkably charismatic and powerful wartime leader. I think I'll skip through some of these details of what was happening in Ukraine since 2014. The one point I would make is the final point there, which was since 2014, especially in the last year or two, Ukraine has been re-equipping its military, getting new anti-tank missiles, anti-aircraft missiles, and some drone technology. And it used that drone to hit an artillery piece in Russian-occupied Donbass last November. And Russia may have been afraid that with each passing year, Ukraine is getting stronger militarily, and they saw in 2020 in Azerbaijan's war on Karabakh, remarkable success for the Azerbaijanis using Turkish drones. And already before the February invasion, Ukraine had bought 20 of those Bayraktar drones. So Russia thought that the time was not on their side and they should move sooner rather than later. Other points of geopolitics is, in addition to the chaos of the Trump presidency, which weakened the US role in the world, and President Trump had even talked about kind of quitting NATO altogether. We also saw the resignation after 16 years in office of German Chancellor Angela Merkel. So she'd been the most powerful figure in European politics and had been able to stand up to Putin. And she resigned, and there was a coalition government formed, and nobody knew. This was in October or November. Nobody knew how strong that new Green Social Democrat coalition would be. So again, Putin sees an opportunity there. Final point about sanctions is that the US and EU did impose sanctions on Russia after the Crimean annexation, but they were targeted on certain individuals and certain sectors and were generally ineffective. At best, they cut Russian GDP growth by about 1% a year. So Putin thought, we've seen what they can do with sanctions. We can handle that. It's not a problem. And again, he underestimated the resolve of the West and the breadth of the sanctions which the US and EU were prepared to inflict on Russia. I think I'll skip through these more academic points and maybe talk a little bit about the sanctions. That the 2014 sanctions were targeted on certain officials and oligarchs. And the kind of theory was that if we make those rich people hurt, they'll go to Putin and complain, and Putin will change his behavior. Of course, that didn't happen. Putin didn't listen to what the oligarchs were saying. He didn't care if they were hurting or not. But he was aware that sanctions would come again. So what he did after 2014 was, one thing he did was to persuade a lot of the Russian oligarchs to return some of their assets and their holding companies back to Russia to make them a little bit more protected from Western sanctions. He also had the central bank build up a war chest of $640 billion of reserves, which he thought would be able to ride out any ban on lending to Russia, at least for 6 months or so. But he was caught out in 2022 when the US and EU organized exclusion of most Russian banks from the bank exchange system, the SWIFT system, and the freezing of Russia's central bank assets abroad. Somewhere between half and 2/3 of Russia's foreign exchange reserves and gold were actually held in bank vaults in London, New York, and Basel, Switzerland. And to Putin's surprise, those were all frozen. And that had never been done to Russia before. It had been done to Iran and Afghanistan and Cuba and North Korea. So it's not completely unknown, but nobody really saw it coming, I think, at least on the Russian side. They didn't see it coming. And that caused a 50% collapse in the value of the ruble in the end of February, but it's now recovered its pre-invasion value due to very draconian measures by the central bank, forcing exporters to change their dollar earnings into rubles. On top of the official sanctions, we've also had, now it's over 600 multinational corporations have voluntarily pulled the plug on their operations in Russia, most notably, most famously, McDonald's shuttered its 850 outlets in Russia. And there's also the leading microchip producers in the world are located in Taiwan and South Korea, and they've also joined the sanctions. And they produce over 70% of the world's microchips. So Russia doesn't produce any of its own microchips, at least not the contemporary generation microchips. So they're going to have severe problems. They'll have to evade the sanctions, get the chips from China, and China's worried in case the US imposes secondary sanctions on Chinese companies that are breaking the sanctions. So this is going to be a real headache for Russian businesses and, for that matter, for the Russian military. So in the short term, we had this financial dislocation. We've had the closing of European airspace to Russian aircraft, and also the problem of lack of spare parts for Russian aircraft, because most of them are a Boeing and Airbus. And if they don't have software updates, if they don't have spare parts, then they don't have a maintenance record and they can't fly internationally. Also, most of their 550 foreign planes are leased, and the leaseholders want the planes back, and Russia's not giving them back. So the whole airspace sector has been severely damaged by these sanctions. In the long run, Russia will have to build a kind of fortress Russia economy. They'll have to figure out ways of getting new software to replace all the Microsoft and Google software, which is no longer going to be available to them. And that's going to be very difficult for them. It's going to take them a lot of effort and a lot of money. And they'll never regain the kind of economic prospects, growth that they were hoping for. One striking feature has been stepped up sanctions of individual oligarchs. So this shows Britain, the UK, US, and EU sanctioning a majority of the top 20 Russian billionaires. It's still not clear, however, what exactly is the goal of the sanctions. Is it to we want to change Putin's behavior through the sanctions, but it's not clear that the hit on the Russian economy will be big enough to kind of force Putin to withdraw his troops from Ukraine. Nor is it clear that the sanctions will be unpopular with the Russian people, causing them to rise up and remove Putin from office. Unfortunately, the opinion polls suggest that from 50 to 70% of Russians approve of Putin's war in Ukraine. They buy the propaganda which the state media is pumping out at them. So the idea of a popular unrest as a result of the sanctions is very unlikely. And the simple fact is that with, this is one of the pro-war rallies that Putin organized last month. The simple fact is that Russia continues to earn about $35 billion per month from its oil and gas exports. Now, most of those go to Europe. Even if Europe cuts back on its purchases, the Chinese and the Indians will step in and buy more oil. The other factor to bear in mind is that even if the volume of sales to Europe shrinks, the price of oil and gas has increased over 50% in the last 2 months. So Russia is getting more money, even while it's selling less oil and gas. So that means that it's got this flow of money coming in, which will be enough probably to meet its international debts and enough to keep the war effort going, especially if China is cooperating and is helping Russia out. One important question is that of the threat of nuclear war, that Putin, a couple of days into the invasion, made a big deal about putting his nuclear forces onto a special regime of combat duty, whatever that means. Nobody was quite sure what it means. And Russia's official security doctrine is that Russia will use nuclear weapons first if it feels that the existence of Russia is threatened. And so this fear of escalation to nuclear war is why the NATO line from the beginning was, we're not going to put any NATO military forces into Ukraine because the risks of escalation are too high. And the Ukrainians were begging for a no-fly zone, which would be enforced by NATO aircraft. But NATO said, no, if we start putting aircraft into Ukraine. There'll be dogfights with Russians. They'll shoot down some of our planes. We'll shoot down some of their planes. We don't want to go there. And that's been a consistent policy of NATO. So the Mother Russia, which I've been studying for 40 years, and I love the country and the people. This is a very ugly face of Russia, which I didn't expect to see Russian army shelling into rubble entire cities in Ukraine, cities like Mariupol and Kharkiv, which are overwhelmingly full of Russian speakers as well. This is totally shocking and unbelievable. What's likely to happen, and this I can end on this slide. Putin is not going to give up. He's going to carry on until he has something that he can call victory. And that's probably going to look like a partitioned Ukraine, with Russia seizing the Black Sea coast, Azov Sea coast between Donbass and Crimea, to have a land bridge to Crimea. That's why Mariupol was so important to them. And also to grab as much territory as he can in East Ukraine. He seems to have given up on the idea of regime change in Kiev because his assault on Kiev failed. So I think we're looking, unfortunately, at a kind of repartitioning of Ukraine. In the long run, the Europeans are going to invest in alternative energy sources and are going to cut back on their imports of Russian oil and gas. So Putin will be building a lot of new pipelines to China and maybe through Afghanistan to Pakistan and India. So Russia will be oriented more towards the east. And that's not going to be very economically profitable for Russia. Its biggest trading partner now is the European Union. And they're not going to get a very good deal from China because China knows they've got the Russians over a barrel. So I think the economic prospects for Russia are very grim. And the political prospects are even grimmer because the degree of authoritarian crackdown in Russia over the past 3 or 4 months is really astonishing. Not just the brutal suppression of anti-war protesters with over 15,000 people arrested, but also getting teachers to teach lessons on the glorious war and the glorious military operation in Ukraine and the genocide the Ukrainians were doing in Donbass, how the Ukrainians are all Nazis. So this is being forced into college and school curricula, and teachers who don't agree with that are often denounced by, or there are cases already of them being denounced by their own pupils and then they're fired. So the overall political situation is very, very grim, and tens of thousands of Russians have been leaving. It's hard for them to get out because they can't fly to Europe anymore. The only place to fly to in Europe is Serbia, has a direct flight. So they're flying to places like Turkey and Georgia and Uzbekistan, where there are still flights and where Russians don't need visas and they can live for 90 days without a visa. So some estimates are over 200,000 Russians have fled. And most of them young, most of them highly educated, including a lot of IT workers who can just set up their business anywhere. And so again, that's a tremendous economic blow to Russia. So I'll stop at that point and invite questions or comments, disagreements, whatever, from the patient audience.
Professor Rutland, thank you so much. That is, as you said, grim outlook, but a fantastic overview of the circumstances and the history that's brought us to where we are right now. Could you speak a little bit, Biden? I saw a headline, President Biden has declared the Russian activity in Ukraine a national genocide. Is that likely to provoke a reaction from Putin, or more steadfast loyalty to the Ukrainians in some way?
Well, I mean, President Biden already a year ago in an interview with George Stephanopoulos called Putin a killer. Right? Stephanopoulos asked him is he a killer? And Biden said, yeah. So there's been this war of words already. And then earlier this year, Biden said Putin was a butcher, you know, and then he said that this guy can't stay in power. So there's already been a very, very high level of invective. And then specifically on the question of war crimes and genocide, I mean, the whole war that Russia unleashed on Ukraine is a war of aggression. It's a war crime to launch this kind of war, unprovoked attack on a neighboring country. And so that's the biggest crime of all to begin with. And then the specific killings of civilians in large numbers, either by indiscriminate shelling of Mariupol or by the what seems to be just mass executions of civilians in the occupied zones. Those are also war crimes. So the problem is, of course, that the history shows us that the only war criminals that get put on trial are the defeated side. So the victors never judge themselves typically, and it's unlikely that Russia will be absolutely defeated in this war, right? So that's just not going to happen. So Putin will still be in power at the end of the war, and so there's no chance that he will be brought to justice anywhere. Added to which, Russia, like the United States, is not a signatory to the International Criminal Court. I think Ukraine also wasn't, but they've signed a decision allowing the ICC to operate on their territory. So, yeah, so these war crimes will probably go largely unpunished, I'm afraid, which is true in many wars, including the war in Syria. The question of genocide specifically, that's obviously a very loaded term. It has to include the intent to destroy in whole or in part a certain ethnic group or religious group. And I think some of the comments that Putin made, like in his July article last year, and then in his speech just before the invasion, and I think if there was to be a trial of genocide, there would be some pretty damning evidence there, where Putin is specifically talking about the Ukrainians as a group that don't have a right to exist, kind of thing. So that I'm not an international lawyer, but to me that gets into that question of intent. But on a more pragmatic level, is it helpful to talk in these terms for President Biden to call Putin a killer and to accuse him of genocide? I'm afraid it may not be terribly helpful, even though that's what we all think. Sometimes it's better not to say what you think. At some point or other, there will be some kind of negotiation with Putin, I'm afraid. And we'll see. That's the best I can do on that question.
Thank you. No, that was excellent. So a few questions in the chat. One audience member is curious if you think that Ukraine will join the EU and NATO once the stalemate takes hold.
Yeah, I think the prospects for Ukraine joining the EU are good now. Before they had this associate status agreement, which meant there was lower tariffs on their products, and also meant visa-free travel. And many Ukrainians were able to move to the EU and find work, because there were 1 million Ukrainians working in Poland even before the invasion. So they were already gradually opening, the EU was already opening the door. And I think the tremendous suffering of the Ukrainians during this war, and the kind of Europeans' feeling of guilt that we paid for this war by buying all this energy from Russia over the years, I think the public opinion in the EU is very, very strongly in favor of helping Ukraine, which will include some kind of path to membership. And in the past, it was always thought, oh, Ukraine's too poor, and it's too big, and it's too corrupt and chaotic, and it has these disputed territories with Russia. So it's like, it's just too many problems. There's no way that Ukraine can join the EU. It's just not conceivable. And I think that's starting to change. It's still, it's going to be a long road, because the EU is very much about rule of law and transparency and democracy. So the Ukrainians have got a long way to go yet. But I think now there's a serious prospect for them, yes. NATO, no. I mean, President Zelensky already said that he's willing to take NATO off the table. So and it'll probably stay off the table, because he's also seen that NATO didn't help anyway, with Ukraine being in this halfway house. So what's the point?
It's well explained. And how would Belarus, or how do you think Belarus would factor into this?
What's that?
How would Belarus factor into this Ukraine joining either NATO or, in fact, the EU when the time comes?
Belarus?
Belarus?
What's that?
The country?
Oh, Belarus. Sorry, yeah.
Sorry.
Belarus, yeah, sorry. It's all about it's all the stress in the Slavic, and I usually get the stress wrong in Russian. I'm always getting it wrong. So Belarus, yeah.
Belarus. My apologies.
Belarus that's an even a sadder case, because it's 10 million people, and they had those massive protests in 2020 against the election of Lukashenko, and they were brutally crushed. It's a harsher political regime even than Russia was, though now Russia is kind of caught up. And back in 1999, Russia and Belarus signed a union state treaty, which made them kind of integrated, separate sovereign countries, but their economic activity is tightly integrated. They don't need a passport to travel between the two countries, kind of thing. And so Belarus it's now kind of become even closer to Russia, because there didn't used to be Russian troops in Belarus. There was a couple of air defense bases, but not Russian army. But in the run-up to the Ukraine war, the Russian army deployed in Belarus. So Belarus has become even closer integrated into Russia. And while Lukashenko is still alive and still in power, he will not fully merge Belarus into Russia. But it's conceivable after Lukashenko leaves office that Russia might just totally incorporate Belarus. That's very possible.
Okay, we have two questions that are sort of tangential to one another. First is, will the world let these war crimes continue with many thousands more of Ukrainian citizens dying before the world takes a more aggressive stance? And that, following up with that, if the Ukraine is partitioned, do you foresee a resistance similar to the French resistance during the Nazi takeover? Should that give the West hope? It might take time, but might ultimately be successful. So sort of where could the West provide aid through a sort of secret resistance army?
Well, the West has been sending a lot of weaponry to Ukraine, which has really helped turn the tide of the war. And that looks set to continue. I mean, it's a little bit surprising that the Russians haven't tried to stop the flow of weapons from Poland by hitting with the Air Force, hitting the supply routes. But I guess the Russian Air Force has not been very effective. They've been afraid of Ukrainian surface-to-air missiles, so they've stayed away from West Ukraine for the most part. So I'm not sure how long that will last, or at some point, Russia may try and make a more serious effort to stop the flow of weapons from Poland. And that's where it kind of gets dangerous in terms of escalation. In the partition scenario, yes, Russia would face a resistance movement. but Russia is so brutal that they would just suppress it. I mean, this was done already when West Ukraine was taken over by the Soviet Union at the end of World War II. There was a resistance movement in Galicia, and that lasted for like five to 10 years. But the Russian response was brutal. If there was any attack, they would go take all the population of the nearest village and deport them to Siberia. You know, maybe kill the men first, and then deport the women and children to Siberia. And that same thing happened in Lithuania at the end of World War II as well. So I thought that was ancient history, but the way that the Russian army has been operating in Ukraine, they're doing the same kind of thing now. So in the face of that kind of brutality, the resistance is very difficult. So I think what would happen more likely is that Ukrainians will simply flee from the East Ukraine and relocate into Central and West Ukraine. And then the Russians will have this depopulated, ruined landscape where nobody wants to live. And you know, that will be the victory.
Next question, are the people living in the Donbass region supportive of Putin's intent?
It's a good question. It's hard to answer that question. I mean, there are some people who've tried to do surveys in the Donbass region, and there is some support for Putin and for the Russian position. But bear in mind that a lot of people have left the territory. So like half the people have left the territory. Some of them went to Russia, some of them went to Ukraine. So all of the people who disagreed with what was happening kind of left. You know? So the kind of polling that you do there is skewed. Also, they're only getting the Russian media, they're getting the Russian propaganda 24/7. So again, what kind of weight can you put on public opinion when people are not having alternative sources of information? So yeah, that I mean, it's there's some support for Russia in the East, but it's not like that was a spontaneous popular uprising. It was organized by the Russian intelligence services back in 2014. Yeah, and it's very highly criminalized. There's a lot of organized crime kind of groups operating. So it's a fairly ugly place to live, I think, the Donbass area, and it's economically been very deprived.
Another question, do you think the IOC will or can ban participations of Russian athletes?
Well, they've been going back and forth on that since the Sochi Olympics drug scandal, which is brilliantly explained in the documentary Icarus. So, but the international sporting agencies have kind of gone back and forth on this. So they allowed Russians to compete, but not as a team, you know. So but they this time around they've been more rigorous, pushing Russia out of the European soccer tournaments and so on. And so I think the cultural boycott and sporting boycott of Russia has been pretty robust. But unfortunately, that just plays into Putin's propaganda about the West is out to get us, you know, the West hates us. So it's a kind of double-edged sword. There are a couple of questions that I can see. I'm not sure if you can see them, Anne.
Okay.
Like somebody asked, has Ukraine cut off the water to Crimea?
Oh, no, I have not seen that.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and that is a problem for Russia. That when they took over Crimea, the water supply came in a canal like 60, 70 miles from the Dnieper River. And yes, the Ukrainians cut it off. They also cut off electricity supply to Crimea. And so there's acute water shortage in Crimea. And the Russians built a bridge to Crimea across the Kerch Straits so they can get some road traffic in. But the water, as I understand it, is a severe problem. And so that's one of the goals of Russia in getting this land bridge to Crimea, is they'll push up to the Dnieper River and get that water supply back. So yes, I think that is a factor in the Russia's decision to move on.
We have a question, two questions actually about rebuilding Ukraine. One is who will help Ukraine rebuild? And tangential to that is when the war is over, will there be a sort of Marshall Plan to help rebuild?
Yeah, I guess we'll see. I'm not sure, you know, going back to the Marshall Plan, yes, we haven't seen this level of destruction in European cities since World War II. I mean, there was a lot of killing in the Bosnian War and the Kosovo War in the 1990s, but the level of destruction in Mariupol it exceeds that of the siege of Sarajevo. Just, you know, the number of buildings that are reduced to rubble is just off the scale. And there's not just Mariupol. There's, you know, a dozen cities: Sumy, Chernihiv, Kharkiv, Mykolaiv. A lot of them have been hit. Kiev itself, you know. So the scale of destruction is vast. And then there's 10 million internally displaced people. It's a quarter of the population, including 4 million of them have gone abroad. Again, these are huge numbers, right? The Palestinian refugees in 1947 was about 1 million. You know, the Yugoslav refugees were, I think, less than 1 million. You know, the 2015 influx from Syria and Afghanistan was about 1 million, 1.5 million. And now we have 4 million, including, by some accounts, 2/3 of all the children in Ukraine are displaced. You know? So these are just astonishing scale of suffering, and the rebuilding. I assume the Europeans will pay for it. I mean, Europe is a rich continent, and they will step up, I think, and maybe there'll be some help from the US. If there was any justice, then the Russians would pay. But I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think there's going to be any legal reparations. And the Russians will presumably rebuild in their occupied Ukraine. They haven't done very much in Donbass right now, but I assume in the long run they will rebuild infrastructure or something. But it's going to be a long, hard process.
I think those are all the questions. I thought it occurred to me to wonder about the influx of refugees throughout Europe, how well they'll be adopted and welcomed and included in the countries that they end up in, with all the strife that's been going on in the EU. You know, so obviously wartime would hopefully soften some hearts about having refugees, but do you see that as becoming kind of a problem area for anti-Ukrainian sentiment?
It doesn't look like it right now. I mean, as you say, the empathy and support has been very strong, and it helps that the overwhelming majority of the refugees are women and children, right? So that the sympathy kicks in there, because the Ukrainians are not allowing men to leave. Men between the ages of 18 and 60 are just not allowed to leave Ukraine. So there are very few men coming out. So that's a big difference from the migration wave of 2015, which was 80% plus men, young men. You know, also there's the race issue, that Ukrainians are, you know, indistinguishable from Poles or anybody else from Eastern Europe, whereas they're Christians, whereas the Syrian and Afghan refugees were predominantly Muslim. And Europe does have a problem with radical Islamist terrorism, right? Including in 2015, the attacks in France. So the combination of racism and Islamophobia and fear of terrorism that meant that the gender dynamic, that meant that the European reception of refugees in 2015 was much more mixed, let's say, suspicious, whereas most of those factors are just not present in this case. Plus, the Poles, the Hungarians, the Romanians had their own experience of living under communism, living under Russian occupation, and it was not a happy experience. And so they've been there themselves. So they viscerally feel, they know what's happening to the Ukrainians. So that's why they're reacting in this way. Of course, Hungary is a complicated case because they have this Viktor Orban, the leader, is very nationalist and has good relations with Putin. And so Hungary has been, they've taken in some refugees, but they're refusing to allow NATO to send a military hardware over the border from Hungary into Ukraine. So Hungary is a bit of a special case. But Poland, which was also very illiberal and nationalist, the PIS government, they've turned full circle, and they're very pro-American, pro-EU, and totally on board with this united policy towards Ukraine.
Excellent. So one comment is the outlook or analysis is grim. Do you think the West should simply encourage Ukraine to give up?
The outlook is grim. I'm sorry to be so negative, but I'm on email every day with Russian friends. I've been to Ukraine 3 times, but I've been to Russia probably 30 times. So I have a lot more connections and friends in Russia, and they're all panicking. They're afraid. They're getting denounced. My friends who are professors are getting denounced by the students. They're getting stopped by the police, and the police look through the social media on their cell phones. It's very, very unsettling, and a lot of them are trying to get out. So given that, it's hard to look for some rosy exit ramp or something. It's a very, very difficult situation, and one of the questions is there any effort within Russia to end this? It's hard to see it because the Russian security apparatus, they've been practicing this for 600 years or so. I mean, this is the way they operate. They've got experience in how you control a society, so that's a very deep tradition that you can't escape very easily, yeah. So the original question was, should we encourage Ukraine to give up? That's a very difficult question. I mean, I don't think we have the right to tell Ukraine to carry on fighting or give up. That's not our responsibility. It's their decision, and obviously it's a very painful decision. But President Zelensky argued, well, if we give up Mariupol, they'll just move all of those forces to the next town. So we give up Mariupol, and then they'll be besieging Zaporizhia, and then Dnipro. So it's like that he made that decision, even if it costs tens of thousands of civilian lives. He didn't see any choice. From his point of view, we have to try and fight and stop them wherever we can. Yeah, like I say, it's not for us to tell him what to do or tell the Ukrainians what to do, I think. But
wise words. Yeah. One quick last question is the average. I know you talked about the Russian media dispensing information, misleading information, or just out and out incorrect information to mislead people. But the question is the average Russian aware that they are so badly misled by their media?
The short answer is no. I think that the average Russian, to the extent that we can tell, believes what the media are telling them. And this is unfortunately true in all societies, that we all live in our own information bubbles. Each country has its own view of the world and our own filtering of information. And so that's the kind of default position, is to fit in, to accept what everybody else is saying. And what's different in the Russian case is that there used to be independent sources. So there used to be an independent radio channel, Echo Moskvy, the independent couple of newspapers, websites. And on YouTube, a lot of the activists put up a lot of anti-corruption videos, Alexei Navalny and others on YouTube. And some of those YouTube videos would have 20 million views, So there was a lot of alternative information available. And yeah, the average Russian didn't look at the internet for news. Only the young people did. Maybe a third of the population was using the internet, getting different points of view. But in the last 6 months or so, one after another, those alternative news sources have been shut down. So they've just closed those independent newspapers, the radio. It's gone off the website. The TV reign is gone. So YouTube is still open, but they've censored some of the channels. And I think before too long, they'll just close YouTube down completely as well. So unfortunately, George Orwell was very prophetic in 1984, the power of propaganda, the way that people can be sucked into believing whatever the state is telling them is very, very powerful. And yeah, so this is why the battlefield is kind of so important, because it's going to be resolved on the battlefield. It's not going to be resolved on the home front, I think, realistically.
Right. Professor Rutland, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your expertise on this, as we've all agreed, very grim subject. It's tremendously helpful to have you give us some aid in understanding what is happening and what to expect, and hopefully perhaps what to look forward to, if only a quick ending to this ridiculous suffering for people. So thank you very, very much. Thank you to everybody for joining us tonight. I hope to see you at another Essex Library program soon. Very much appreciated for your attendance. And Professor Rutland, again, deep, deep gratitude for all your help tonight. Much appreciated. Take care, everybody.
Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure.